The first thing his daughter said to him that mattered, she said in a parking lot outside a grocery store, holding a bag of frozen peas against her own elbow, and it was an apology. She said, "I'm sorry about the door." Emory Pulliam did not know what that meant. He said what any father would say, which is that it was fine, honey, whatever it was, and she nodded and got in the car, and he drove them home, and it took him another 19 days to understand that his fourth grader had just told him everything, out loud, in 5 words, in the only way she had left. "I'm Nathan. I want to tell you about a man whose entire profession is other people's words, and about the sentence he could not read, and about what a child does when she has decided that the adults are not coming." Emory Pulliam was 36 years old and had been a certified sign language interpreter for 13 of those years. It is a job people misunderstand. They imagine a man in a tuxedo beside a politician. The real work is a hospital at 2 in the morning, a courtroom on a Tuesday, a parent-teacher conference, an insurance adjuster explaining a total loss to a woman who has never once in her life been told anything at a speed she could actually receive. It is voicing for a man in a wheelchair whose brother speaks over him. It is standing in a small room while a doctor says a word that will reorganize a family, and having to hand that word across, exactly, without softening it, because softening it is a lie, and lies are the one thing his license does not allow. A month before any of this started, Emory Pulliam spent a Thursday afternoon in a small windowless room at a hospital in Zanesville, interpreting for a woman being told that the lump in her husband's neck was what they had been afraid it was. The doctor was kind and used 41 words where 9 would have done. The woman's hands were in her lap. Her husband, who was the deaf one in the room, watched Emory's hands and then looked past them at his wife's face, which is what everybody does, always, because a face is faster than any language. Emory rendered it exactly. He did not round it off. When the doctor said, "We're looking at a fairly aggressive presentation," he did not sign, "It's serious." He signed what the man said, at the speed the man said it, including the pause where the doctor lost his nerve halfway through. Afterwards, in the corridor, the woman thanked him, and he did the thing he always does, which is nod and get out of the way, because the moment an interpreter becomes a person in the story, he has damaged the story. He drove home from that one with the radio off. He told me it was an ordinary Thursday. He was good at it. He was known for being good at it, for a stillness, a way of dropping his own face out of the transaction so the message could travel clean. He had a rule he'd been taught in his 2nd year by a woman named Ramona Teft, who ran the interpreter roster for 3 counties and who had hired him twice before he was any good. You are not in the room, you are the window. 13 years of being the window is a strange way to make a living, and it does something to a man. It makes him professionally allergic to opinions. It gets him extremely good at watching a body for meaning, the shoulder that comes up an inch, the hand that stops halfway, because 90% of what he carries is not in anybody's hands. It's in the face. And it made him, in his own house, a man who waited to be told. I asked him once what the hardest part of the job is, expecting him to say the medical rooms or the courtrooms. He said it is the family meetings. He said the hospital is easy because everybody in a hospital knows they are in a hospital. The hard rooms are the ones where a family has been running a private arrangement for 30 years, where the hearing sister has been speaking for the deaf brother since they were children, and answering questions on his behalf, and deciding what he needs to know. And an interpreter walks in, and suddenly the brother can talk directly to the doctor, and the sister's face does something complicated, and everybody discovers at once who has actually been in charge. He said you can watch a family find out what it has been doing to somebody, live, in a chair, in about 90 seconds. He is very good at seeing that in other people's houses. He and Jessa had been divorced for 2 years by the summer this starts. They had married young, in Mullen Fork, Ohio, a town of about 6,000 between 2 state routes, and the marriage had been a real one for a while, and then a long negotiation, and then nothing at all. Elsie came first. Lyndon came 6 years later, and by then they were already living like 2 people sharing a hallway. They had been, at the start, 2 people who were good in a crisis and bad at Tuesdays. Jessa Cruz was a year older than him, had grown up 2 streets over, and had a particular kind of competence he had found magnetic at 22. She could organize anything, walk into any office and be taken seriously, get a refund out of a company that did not give refunds. What he did not understand until much later was where that came from. Her father had left when she was 7, and her mother had gone under for most of a decade afterwards, and Jessa had been the one who did the school forms and the phone calls and the pretending. She had been the person who noticed, in her own house, at that same age, with nobody to tell. I want you to hold that alongside everything she does in this story, because I do not think it excuses 1 minute of it. And I do think it explains why a woman would look at an arrangement that was working and decide, hard, not to examine it. The marriage did not end over anything you could put in a sentence. It ended the way most of them do. A long, slow, entirely mutual withdrawal of attention, punctuated near the end by a few weeks in which Emory started having coffee with a woman from the interpreter roster named Colleen and did not tell his wife, and by the fight about that, which was the last real conversation they had. The split was not violent. That is worth saying, because the version people wanted was the violent one, and its absence is part of why nobody looked. There was no restraining order. There was no incident. There was a parenting plan drafted by Jess's attorney and signed in a conference room in the county seat, and Emory signed it because his lawyer told him what everybody's lawyer tells them, which is that a fight costs more than it wins. The mediation itself took 2 sessions in a conference room over a title office, with a mediator who kept a bowl of butterscotch candies on the table like a man who had learned that adults regress. Emory remembers almost nothing of the money part. He remembers that Jessa arrived with a printed binder with tabs in it, and that when the mediator asked whether there were any concerns about the other parent's household, she said, in a level voice, that she wanted language about who was allowed around the children, and that she had brought a draft. He remembers thinking, she has been working on this for weeks. He also remembers, and this is the part that turns your stomach in retrospect, that he was embarrassed. There is a specific humiliation in being handed a document that assumes you are a danger, by a person who watched you get up at 3 in the morning for 6 years, and the reflex it produces in a decent man is to sign it fast and stop talking about it. Jessa got the house and primary custody. Emory got alternate weekends and Wednesdays, and a 2-bedroom above a dry cleaner on Fielding Street. And Jessa got a clause. This is going to matter more than anything else in the story, so I want to put it in front of you now, the way it sat in that document. On page 6, in the ordinary bloodless language these things are written in. No adult other than a parent or a person named in Exhibit B may transport the minor children. Any overnight absence of a minor child from the residence of the custodial parent requires 24 hours written notice to the other parent. Jessa's attorney had drafted that. Jessa had insisted on it, at length, in mediation, over Emory's objection. She had insisted on it because Emory had been seeing a woman named Colleen for a few months at the end of the marriage, and Jessa had decided, correctly or not, that Colleen was never going to be in a car with her children. So the clause existed because of jealousy. It was written to bind him. Nobody in that conference room, including the man who would eventually use it, thought it was worth arguing about. Colleen, for the record, ended it with him 4 months after the divorce, for the unremarkable reason that she did not want to be somebody's proof of anything. She moved to Columbus. She is not in the rest of this story at all, which is worth noticing, given that the clause written to keep her out of a car is the reason 2 children are safe. The trouble started with a roof. In April of that year, the building on Fielding Street had a fire 2 units down, an electrical thing in a wall, nobody hurt, but the whole top floor went uninhabitable, and Emory's apartment along with it. He lost most of what he owned to water. He had renter's insurance, and it paid, eventually, the way those things pay, which is slowly and less than you thought. He had somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks of nowhere to live, in a town with a rental vacancy rate near 0, in a county where the nearest apartment complex had a waiting list. Jessa offered him the basement. I have gone back and forth on why she did that, and I think the honest answer is the least dramatic one. She did it because it was cheap for her and expensive for him. He would be in the house, but downstairs. He would be a resource, and she would get to be the one who had been generous. Emory said yes, because he had 2 children and 1 car and no address. So in the last week of April, a 36-year-old man moved into the finished basement of the house he used to own a half of, in the town he grew up in, and started sleeping under his own children. The basement had a bathroom, a washer, a dehumidifier that ran constantly, and a small window at ground level that showed him the bottom 8 inches of the driveway. He put a mattress on the floor and a lamp on a milk crate and hung his work clothes. The interpreter's uniform is a plain dark shirt, always, so the hands read clean, on a length of pipe. He was there for 9 weeks in total. He would tell you that in those 9 weeks he was the most useful he had been to his own children since the divorce. He did school drop-off. He did bath time. He learned that Lyndon would eat a whole plate of anything if you cut it into strips. He sat on the floor of the living room every evening while Elsie did homework at the coffee table and complained about a boy named Dominic. And he would tell you, and has told me, in a flat voice, that he was also the least alert he has ever been in his life. Because being a guest in a house you used to own is a full-time job of managing your own face. Del Swindell had been living in that house since February. He was 44, a big, warm, loud man who fixed things. Actually fixed them. That's the part people forget when they tell this story now. He had re-roofed the back porch in a weekend. He had taken Lyndon's tricycle apart and gotten the seized bearing out with a punch and a hammer and made a whole afternoon out of it, narrating, and the boy had laughed himself sick. He remembered names. He asked about people's mothers. In a small town that is nearly the whole of a reputation. He was also, and this is a fact and not a slur, an addict, pills, and had been for 11 years across 2 states, with the specific charm that a certain kind of long-term user develops as a survival organ. Charm is a tool. He was extremely good with it. He had been in and out of a program in Zanesville twice. Jessa knew all of that. She would say later that she knew all of that, and that she had made a decision about it with her eyes open, and I believe her. What she did not know, what she was told and chose to hear as a different sentence, was what Del's son did for a living. The town's opinion of Del Swindell is a thing I had to reconstruct from about a dozen people, and it is remarkably consistent. Everybody liked him, and nobody trusted him with money. He had done a season on a roofing crew and left owed wages that he told 3 different stories about. He had borrowed a trailer from a man at the Methodist church and returned it, eventually, with a bent tongue and a joke. He was the guy you called to get a wasp nest out of a soffit, and he came, same day, and would not take anything for it, and then 2 months later he needed $140 for a part, and you gave it to him, and that was the last you thought about it until you were telling a story about him at a funeral. Jessa met him in the parking lot of the garden center where she works, in January, when her car would not start and he was 2 spaces over with jumper cables, and 40 minutes he did not appear to need for anything else. That is exactly how it happened. She has told it that way to several different professionals, and it has never varied. And I believe it, because that is the way charm actually works. It does not arrive as seduction. It arrives as competence in a parking lot on the worst morning of your week. Tate Swindell was 19 and had been staying in the front room since March, which was supposed to be a 2-week thing. He was quiet in the way that reads as polite. He said, "Sir." He carried in groceries without being asked. He was up at odd hours and slept until noon and had a car, a gray Corolla with a bad belt that squealed for about 6 seconds on a cold start and then went quiet, a detail that is going to come back. And he drove for a man in Deaver County who moved pills up 2 state routes and had been doing it since he was 17. Not a kingpin, not a movie. A 19-year-old with a car and a phone, paid $200 a run, doing runs most weeks between towns that all look the same at 1 in the morning. Here is the part I need you to understand, because it is the engine of everything that comes after, and it is the single most disgusting piece of practical thinking I have ever had to explain in one of these. A young man alone in a car at 1 in the morning gets pulled over. A young man in a car at 1 in the morning with a sleeping toddler in a car seat in the back does not. He is a guy driving his little brother home from grandma's. He is a guy whose kid wouldn't settle. He gets a different tone of voice from the window of a cruiser, a different set of questions, a shorter stop, and, this is the piece that mattered to the people paying him, an officer who is thinking about a child and not about a trunk. Tate Swindell had figured that out on his own. He said so, later, and he said it without any particular shame, the way you'd explain a shortcut. He started taking Lyndon Pulliam out of the house at night in the 2nd week of May. The economics, since people always ask, Tay was paid $200 a run, 3 runs a week, which is $2,400 a month for a 19-year-old, in a county where a full-time job at the plastics plant pays about the same and takes 160 hours. He had been doing it for 2 years. He had almost nothing to show for it, which is the other thing everybody gets wrong about this world. There is no pile of money at the end. There is a car with a bad belt and a phone that has to be replaced every 6 weeks. The man who paid him was named in the indictment as a 31-year-old in Beaver County who had 11 people driving for him and who did not himself drive anywhere. Tay-Tay had met him twice. That is what the top of this looks like from the bottom. A man you have met twice. Lyndon was 3. He slept hard, the way 3-year-olds do. He was carried out asleep in a fleece blanket, buckled into a seat that lived in the Corolla's back, driven for between 40 minutes and 2 hours, and carried back in. Most nights he never woke up at all. On the nights he did, there was a phone with cartoons on it and a bag of the little orange crackers he liked, and by morning it was a dream he could not tell anybody about because he was 3 and did not have the words yet. There is a version of this where Tay-Tay is a monster, and I have read enough of his interviews to tell you he is not that. He is something more depressing. He is a 19-year-old who solved a logistics problem. When the detective asked him whether he had ever thought about what would happen to the boy if he got stopped and arrested with the child in the car, he said, and this is a direct quote from the transcript, "I figured they'd call his mom." That is the whole moral architecture. He had thought about it exactly that far and then stopped, because thinking about it further would have cost him $200 a night. Dell knew. Dell had suggested it, in fact, though he would spend a long time telling people he hadn't, and Jessa knew. That is the sentence people fight me on. So let me be precise about what "knew" means here, because it is more human and much worse than the cartoon version. She knew Tay-Tay took the baby for drives. She was told it helped the boy sleep. Lyndon had been a bad sleeper his whole life, up 2 and 3 times a night, and in the second week of May that stopped, which any mother of a bad sleeper will tell you, is the kind of miracle you do not interrogate. She was told Tay-Tay drove him around the block. She was told it was 10 minutes. She was tired in a way that had been accumulating for 3 years, and she had a full-time job at a garden center, and a toddler, and a 9-year-old, and a boyfriend, and a basement tenant who used to be her husband, and somebody offered to take one thing off the pile. Was she paid? Later, the state would show $400 a month coming into her account from Dell in a pattern that started the same week the drive started. Her position was that it was rent. I don't think she asked herself a single hard question. I think she built a house around the answer she wanted and lived in it. Those are not the same as innocence, and the court eventually agreed, but they are also not the same as a woman who put her son in a drug car for money, and I'm not going to sell you a simpler version than the one that happened. Emory Pulliam was 9 years old, and she was the only person in that house who was doing arithmetic. She shared a room with her brother. That had started as a temporary arrangement when Emory moved into the basement. Her old room became his, sort of. In the loose way a basement becomes a room, and it had never gone back. She was a serious kid, not fragile, not one of those children the story makes into a saint afterward. She was stubborn and a little sharp and had opinions about fairness that she would go to war over, and she had been, for 2 years, the one who noticed things, which grown-up was in a mood, which promise was going to get quietly dropped, which questions made her mother's mouth go flat. Her days, that spring, looked completely normal. That is the thing I most want people to sit with. She went to school. She got a 94 on an Ohio history project about canal towns. She had a fight with a girl named Priya about a seat, and then made up. She was in the school play as a narrator, which her mother came to, and there is a photograph of the two of them afterwards in which Jessa is beaming and Elsie is smiling with her mouth, and not with anything else. Her teacher that year, a man in his 50s named Warren Elsie, said later that she got quieter in May and that he had made a note to keep an eye on it, and that he had assumed, on the evidence available, that it was the divorce catching up with her. Everybody had a reasonable explanation. That is how a house like that stays standing. Every single person is holding a plausible sentence. She noticed the first drive because she was awake. She was awake because she had been awake most nights since the divorce. Not dramatically, just the ordinary insomnia of a kid whose life got rearranged without her being consulted. She heard the door. She heard the belt squeal in the driveway. She saw her brother's bed empty and the blanket gone, and she stood in the middle of that room at 1 in the morning in a state I do not have a good word for. She did consider telling, I want to be accurate about that, because the story where a child never considers it is a story that lets the adults off. She thought about telling her teacher, and did not, because she had watched a boy in her class get taken out of school for 2 weeks after he told a counselor about his father, and she had absorbed the wrong lesson from it, which is the correct lesson, from a 9-year-old's vantage, that telling makes you disappear. She thought about telling her father, and this is the one that will follow Emory into the ground. She got as far, twice, as sitting on the basement stairs while he was folding laundry. What stopped her was the arithmetic she had already run. Her dad had no house. Her dad had lost everything to a fire and was sleeping on a mattress on a floor in her mother's basement. If she told him, he would have to do something, and the only thing he could do was fight a grown man in a driveway, and then there would be police, and her father would be the one arrested, because he was the one who did not live there. She was in 4th grade, and she had constructed a completely coherent risk model, and she was substantially right about all of it. And then she did what a child does when she has no phone, no money, no car, and no adult she is confident about. She started guarding the door. I want to describe what that looked like, and I want you to hold in your head that every single item on this list is a thing a child improvised alone, in the dark, without telling anyone, in a house with 3 adults in it. She moved her bed. Not far, 18 inches, until the foot of it blocked the door's swing. It looked like a kid rearranging her room. She took a chair from the dining set and kept it in the room, and at night she wedged it under the handle. In the morning she put it back, because if it stayed there somebody would ask. She took a length of parcel string from the junk drawer and tied one end around the doorknob and the other around her wrist. She had worked out that she slept through the door, but she did not sleep through her arm being pulled. She stopped changing into pajamas. She slept in her clothes with her coat on the end of the bed. She started keeping the kitchen timer under her pillow, the wind-up kind with the bell removed, because she'd figured out how to take the bell off, and she set it to go off, silently, by vibration under her head, every 90 minutes. And she got into her brother's bed and slept against the rail of it, on her side, facing the door. She did that for a month and a half, in a house with 3 adults in it, and not one of us noticed. Her mother did not notice. Dell did not notice. And Emory Pulliam, whose entire professional life was reading meaning off bodies, was asleep 1 floor below her, and did not notice either. He noticed other things, and this is what I mean when I say the truth is usually available, and just not assembled. He noticed that Lyndon was sleeping through the night, and was glad. He noticed that his son was falling asleep at daycare in the mornings, because the director, a woman named Adelia Cawthron, mentioned it to him at pickup in the first week of June, in the specific over-careful voice of someone raising a thing for the 2nd time. He said the boy was probably going through a growth spurt. He noticed that Elsie had stopped hugging him goodbye at the door on Wednesdays and started hugging him in the driveway instead, outside, where you can see the whole street. He noticed that she had asked him, twice, in the same week, whether the basement door locked from the inside. He noticed, on the 6th of June, that his 9-year-old had a horizontal red mark around her left wrist, and when he took her hand and turned it over, she pulled it back and said she'd been playing with a jump rope, and he, a man whose license requires him to render exactly what he receives, no more, no less, accepted the sentence at face value. On the 9th of June, this one he found out about afterwards, from the daycare file, Lyndon Pulliam fell asleep in a plastic chair at 9:10 in the morning with a piece of toast still in his hand, and Adelia Cawthron took a photograph of it on her phone and did not send it to anybody, and did not delete it either. She had been doing early childhood work for 26 years. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and she also knew that she had already made the call and been told it did not meet the threshold, and there is a particular kind of professional despair in that, which is that you have used up the one lever you have, and the lever did nothing. Then, on the 14th of June, in a grocery store parking lot, she said she was sorry about the door. The door in question had a split in the frame near the strike plate, about 4 inches long, fresh, and Jessa had found it 2 days earlier and had been annoyed about it in the general way she was annoyed about the house. Elsie had said she'd slammed it. Nobody had followed up. What had actually happened, at 2:15 in the morning on the 12th, is that Tay-Tay Swindell had come to the door and found the handle wedged and had put his shoulder into it, twice, and the frame had split, and a child of 9 had held a dining chair with both hands from the other side, and had not made a single sound because her brother was asleep 4 feet away, and she did not want him to wake up scared. He got in, he took the boy, he told her, on the way out, in a completely reasonable voice, that if she told her dad would be in the driveway trying to fight a grown man, and it would end with police, and with everybody separated. And did she want that? She was 9. She believed him, because it was true. And then 2 days later, in a parking lot, she apologized to her father for the door. That is the sentence Emory could not read. Not because it was subtle, because he was standing too close, and because the version of the world where it made sense was a version he had not yet let himself have. He thought about it for 19 days anyway. That is the thing about a man who does that job. He does not have opinions, but he does have a mechanism that will not shut off, and it kept handing him the same 3 items and asking him to make a sentence out of them: a mark on a wrist, a split door frame, and an apology for something that could not possibly have been her fault. He spent those 19 days doing what a careful man does instead of acting, which is gathering context that does not help. He asked Jessa, once, over the kitchen counter, in the flattest voice he could manage, whether Lyndon was sleeping better because of something. She said the boy had grown out of it. She said it without a flicker, and he watched her face while she said it. 13 years of watching faces. And what he saw was a woman telling the truth. Because she was. She believed the 10 minutes around the block version. Her face was clean because her conscience had been furnished. He asked Elsie if anything was going on at home, at the kitchen table, in front of a bowl of cereal, on a Saturday morning with her mother in the next room. Think about the conditions of that question. In the house, in the kitchen, within earshot. And he asked it in the general form. Is everything okay? Which is the form that has exactly one available answer. She said yes. On the 3rd of July, a Wednesday, he came upstairs at 10 past midnight for water. He came up in socks. Not sneaking, just a man who lives in a basement and does not want to wake a household. And the door to the children's room was open 6 inches, and there was a nightlight on inside, and he stopped in the hallway and looked in. His daughter was on top of the covers in her brother's bed, in jeans and a sweatshirt, with her shoes on the floor beside her arranged so she could get into them in one motion. Her left arm was hanging off the side of the mattress, and there was parcel string around her wrist, and the other end of it went up and across and was tied to the inside doorknob. A dining chair was standing against the door, tipped forward, the top rail wedged under the handle. Her brother was asleep against the wall with her arm across him, and she was awake. She had heard the stairs. She was lying completely still with her eyes open, watching the gap in the door, waiting to see whose feet it was. When she saw it was him, she did not look relieved. That is the detail that took the floor out from under him and that he still cannot talk about without stopping. His daughter looked at her father in the doorway at midnight, and her face did not change, because he was not, in the accounting she had been running for 6 weeks, a category of help. He said her name, and Emory Pulliam said, "It's not tonight, Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays, sometimes Fridays." She had not written it down anywhere. She had just been holding it, alone, in her head, for a month and a half. Emory Pulliam sat down on the floor of that room, with his back against the wall, and asked his daughter to tell him what she meant, and she told him, in a flat, tired, competent voice, and it took 11 minutes. Then he did 3 things, in this order, and every one of them is the reason this story ends the way it does, instead of the way it usually does. He did not go up the hall to Del Swindell's room. He did not wake Jessa. He picked up his son. He carried Lyndon down the stairs and out the side door and put him in his own car in the boy's seat. The one that lived in the Corolla was not his. And then he came back for Elsie, who was already at the door with her shoes on and her coat, because she had been dressed for this since the middle of May, and the 2 of them and a sleeping 3-year-old were on the state route out of Mullen Fork by 25 past midnight. Elsie did not ask where they were going. She sat in the front, with her coat still zipped, and her hands in her lap, and watched the mirrors. And about 6 miles out of town, she said, "You have to keep going straight at the light, or he'll see us at the corner." And Emory understood that his daughter had a map of that town's sightlines in her head. He drove to the 24-hour urgent care in the county seat because it was open, it was lit, it had cameras, and it had staff. And because he had spent 13 years in medical rooms and knew, in his bones, that a man alone with 2 children at 1 in the morning needs to be somewhere with witnesses. He called the sheriff's department from the parking lot before he went in. Inside, at 20 to 2 in the morning, a physician assistant named Bryce examined a sleeping 3-year-old who did not wake up for any of it and found nothing. No marks, no smell. A well-nourished, deeply asleep boy in a fleece blanket. She wrote that down, and she also wrote down, because Emory asked her to, and because she had been doing overnights for 6 years and had learned to write down more than she was asked, the exact words the girl used, unprompted, while sitting on the end of the exam table with her shoes still on. She said, "It's not about tonight. He comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays and sometimes Fridays, and the car makes a noise for about 6 seconds when it starts." Bryce wrote the 6 seconds down. She did not know what it meant. It is in the medical record, timed 0152, and a detective read it 11 days later and went very quiet, because by then he had the Corolla on a service station camera at 0106 on a Sunday and had spent an afternoon trying to work out how to prove which car it was. The first deputy took a report that went nowhere useful. That is not a failure of the deputy. It is what a report is. A father says a 19-year-old has been taking his 3-year-old out at night. There is no injury on the boy. There is no drug in the boy. It is one man's account of a thing that is not happening at the moment he is describing it. And by dawn, Jessa had been woken by a phone call and had said, on the record, that she was aware of the drives, that they were harmless, that her ex-husband had lost his housing and was under stress, and that she wanted her children returned. And there it would have died, the way these die, except for page 6. Emory Pulliam sat in a parking lot at 4 in the morning with 2 children asleep in his car and read the parenting plan on his phone and found the clause his ex-wife's attorney had written to keep another woman away from his kids. No adult other than a parent or a person named in Exhibit B may transport the minor children. Tay-Tay Swindell was not in Exhibit B. Exhibit B had 3 names in it: Jessa's mother, Emory's mother, and a neighbor named Wilda Monk, who had watched the kids twice in 2021. Dell Swindell was not in Exhibit B either. Any overnight absence of a minor child from the residence of the custodial parent requires 24 hours written notice. He had not received one, not once, not in 6 weeks, for what turned out to be somewhere north of 20 separate nights. That is not a drug case. That is not a case that requires anybody to believe a 9-year-old over 3 adults. It is a stack of black-letter violations of an order signed by a judge, and it converts a father's frightening story into emotion. He did not sleep. He sat in the urgent care parking lot with the engine off and the windows down, and his son in a car seat, and his daughter asleep against the door, and at about 4:30, he did the only thing left, which was to read. He was in Bernadine Lowen's office at 9 that morning, with his children asleep on her waiting room couch. Lowen was 61, had done family law in Beaver County for 29 years, and she read page 6, and then read it again, and then said the sentence, "Emory says he will hear for the rest of his life. She wrote this to hold you. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She wrote this. Emergency ex parte means the other side is not there. That sounds unfair, and it is, deliberately, because the alternative is telling a household that a motion is coming and giving it a night to rearrange itself. The hearing took 19 minutes. Lowen did not raise her voice once. She put the order on the bench, opened it to page 6, and read the 2 sentences aloud in the tone of a woman reading a grocery list. Then she put the daycare file next to it. Then she put down 11 photographs. The judge asked one question. He asked whether the father had had any contact with either of the men in the household since leaving. Lowen said no, that he had driven to a lit public building and called the sheriff from the parking lot, and the judge looked at Emory for about 3 seconds longer than he needed to, and then signed. Jessa was served at the garden center at 2:10 that afternoon, in the break room, by a process server who had been doing it for 20 years and who told Lowen afterwards, unprompted, that in his experience there are 2 reactions, and this was the second one. The woman read it twice and then asked, out loud, to nobody, "Where are my kids right now?" And then, before anyone answered, sat down. She did not call Dell. That is in the phone records. She called her mother. They filed for an emergency ex parte order the same day. Lowen did not lead with the pills. She led with the paper. 20+ unnoticed overnight absences. An unlisted adult transporting a 3-year-old. A 9-year-old's account of a forced door. Photographs of a split doorframe. Of a length of parcel string. Of a chair. And then she added the one thing that made a judge sign it before lunch. And it came from a woman nobody had thought to ask. Adelia Cawthron, the daycare director, had filed a report in the last week of May. She had done it correctly. She had documented that a 3-year-old was arriving unable to stay awake past 9:20 in the morning, 3 days a week, on a repeating pattern, and that his mother's explanation had changed twice. She had called the county line. She had been told it did not meet the threshold. She had filed her copy and gone back to work, and assumed, the way everybody assumes, that somebody with more authority than her had looked at it and knew better. Nobody had ever gone back and asked her a single follow-up question. Emory's lawyer subpoenaed her file on the Thursday, and it landed like a bomb, because it was dated, it was independent, it was from a mandated professional, and it matched the nights. The judge granted temporary emergency custody to Emory Pulliam that afternoon, and ordered no contact between the children and either Swindell. The 9 months that followed were not dramatic, and they were the hardest part, and nobody makes videos about them. There was a guardian ad litem named Hollis, a woman with a caseload of 61 children and a Corolla of her own, which Emory found funny in a way that was not funny, who came to the apartment twice and to the house twice, and who spent 40 minutes on the floor with Lyndon and a bucket of plastic dinosaurs and got more out of that boy than any adult had in 6 weeks. Not about the car, about whether he liked the dark. He did not. There was a parenting fitness assessment that Jessa took and passed on every scale except one. There was a psychologist's report, 17 pages, that Emory has read so many times he can find the sentence with his thumb. It said that the mother demonstrated genuine warmth and consistent basic care, and that she had prioritized adult stability over child safety, and that when the evaluator asked her directly what she thought her daughter had been doing with the chair, she had said, after a long pause, that she thought Elsie had been playing a game. That is not a lie. That is worse than a lie. That is a woman looking straight at the evidence and choosing, in real time, in a professional's office, with everything on the line, the version she could survive. And there was Jessa's mother, Carla, who is 62, and who had gone under for most of a decade when Jessa was a child and had come back and never once been asked to account for it. She testified. She was called by Emory's side, which I did not expect the first time I read the file. She sat in a chair in a courtroom in Beaver County and said that her daughter had raised herself and had learned that the way you keep a household standing is that you do not look at the thing that would knock it over, and that she, Carla, had taught her that, without ever saying a word about it, by being unlookable at for years. Then she said she was sorry, to the room, which is not a thing a witness is supposed to do. The rest of it came apart fast, the way these things do once one true document is on a table. The sheriff's department, which had had nothing to work with on Tuesday, had a court finding and a daycare report by Friday, and a 19-year-old with a gray Corolla and a phone full of the world's least careful text messages. They did not need Elsie. They never once needed a 9-year-old to testify, and Lowen made sure of that, and Emory says it is the only thing about that summer he is proud of. Tate Swindell pled to trafficking and to child endangering. He got 7 years. Del Swindell was charged with complicity and with permitting child abuse, and took a plea for 39 months. He wrote Emory a long letter from Belmont about a year in, explaining himself. Emory did not read past the first page, which he says he regrets a little, because he is a curious man, and because a professional lifetime of carrying other people's words makes you want to know what's in the envelope. But he had a rule by then, and the rule was that Del Swindell did not get any more of his attention. Jessa was not charged criminally. The county reviewed it and declined, and I have opinions about that which do not matter. What happened to Jessa is that she lost her children, not in a scene. There was no gavel moment. It happened across 9 months of hearings, evaluations, a guardian ad litem, a parenting fitness assessment, and a psychologist's report that used the phrase, prioritized adult stability over child safety. And at the end of it, Emory Pulliam had sole legal and physical custody. and Jessa Cruz had supervised visitation at a family center in the county seat, 2 hours every other Saturday, in a room with a window in the door. She has never missed one. I want that on the record too, because I've been doing this a long time and I've learned to be careful about which parts of a person I decide are the whole person. Elsie is 13 now. She sleeps in her own room, in an apartment on the other side of the county, and she sleeps in pajamas, which took 1.5 years. She goes to therapy on Tuesdays and complains about it exactly as much as a 13-year-old should. She is very funny. She has a friend group, and a phone, and an opinion about everything. And for about the first 8 months she could not be in a room where the door was closed, if she couldn't see who was on the other side of it. And Emory took every interior door in that apartment off its hinges and stacked them in a closet. And they lived like that, in a place with no doors, for most of 1 year, until she said one Saturday that she thought maybe the bathroom one could go back up. The doors came off in the second week. It started with the bathroom. She would not use it with the door shut, and would not use it with the door open, and the compromise they landed on at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, after 20 minutes of a child crying in a hallway in a rented apartment, was that Emory took the pin out of the hinge with a screwdriver and a nail, and carried the door into the hall closet. Then the bedroom door, because she said she could not hear the front door through it. Then, for reasons neither of them could ever articulate, the closet doors, all 4 of them, which meant that for most of 1 year their clothes were simply visible, all the time, in every room, like a stage set. He never once told her it was silly. He never once said she was safe now, because he had worked out. And this is the part I think is the most useful thing in this whole story for anybody watching who has a kid in this position. That you're safe now is a claim about the future, and she had recently and correctly concluded that adults' claims about the future were unreliable. So instead he told her what was true in the present tense, every night, in the same 3 sentences, for about 4 months. The door is off. I am in the next room. Nobody is coming in this house tonight. Therapy took a long time to work. The first therapist was wrong for her, a warm, gentle woman who wanted to talk about feelings, and Elsie, who had spent 6 weeks running a security operation, treated the sessions like an interrogation to be survived. The second one, a man in his 60s named Ives, who had done 20 years in child trauma and had a chessboard on the table, said almost nothing for the first 4 sessions and let her win twice and then lose badly, and somewhere in the 8th or 9th week she told him about the parcel string. She had never told her father about the string. She had let him see it. Those are different, and it took a professional to get the difference out of her. She had wanted him to see it, and she had not wanted to say it, because saying it would have made it her fault that he now had to do something. Lyndon is 7 and remembers none of it. This is the thing that keeps his father up. The boy has no memory of the Corolla, no memory of the crackers, no memory of being carried out of a house asleep 20-some times. It is his sister's story and not his, and one day, somebody is going to tell it to him. And Emory has been trying for 4 years to figure out how you hand a person a thing like that. He asked me, once, and I did not have an answer for him either. Jessa Cruz still works at the garden center. She is a supervisor now. On a Tuesday in April, 3 years after all of this, a woman came in wanting to know whether the hydrangeas would take on the north side of a house, and Jessa walked her out to the lot and explained about soil pH, and about how the blue ones go pink if you don't stay on top of them, and was good at it, and was kind about it, and the woman asked, the way people do, whether she had kids. And Jessa Cruz said, 2, a girl and a boy. And that was true. And she went back inside, and rang up a bag of soil, and had lunch at 11:40 like she does, and drove home. Every other Saturday she is in a room with a window in the door for 2 hours, and she has never missed one. And at the end of each of them her daughter hugs her, briefly, on the way out, in the corridor, where you can see the whole hall. One more thing about that summer, and then I'll get out of the way. About 3 weeks after the emergency order, when it was clear the case was going the way it was going, Emory Pulliam did something that his lawyer advised against in writing. He went back to the daycare, and he asked to speak to Adelia Cothran. He did not go to thank her, although he did that too. He went because he had a question, and the question was, how many other times? She sat with him in a room with alphabet carpet squares on the floor, and she told him the truth, which is that in 26 years, she had made that call 11 times, and that she could tell him what happened in every single one. 2 had gone somewhere. 2. The rest had come back as not meeting the threshold, or had come back as nothing at all. And in each of those cases, she had gone on watching a child arrive every morning and had eventually stopped being able to remember which report went with which face. Emory asked her why she kept making them. She said, "Because the one time it works, it works." And then she said something he repeated to me twice, which is that the report is not the point. She said the report is a thing you file, so that later, when somebody finally comes looking, there is already a piece of paper with a date on it waiting for them, and that in her whole career, she had only once had somebody actually come looking. That is the part that I cannot get comfortable with. Her file did not save those children. It sat in a drawer for weeks doing nothing at all. What saved those children is that a man's lawyer thought to subpoena it, which means the file only ever worked because somebody, downstream, with standing and a phone, went and asked for it. There were people in that town who had noticed something, a daycare director, a teacher who made a note, and a physician assistant at 2 in the morning who wrote down 6 seconds of engine noise because a kid said it. None of them could do anything alone. All of them turned out to be holding a corner of it anyway. So, the thing I keep coming back to. Everybody wants the lesson here to be about the drugs, or about the boyfriend, or about picking better people. It isn't. The men in this story are the least interesting thing in it. The lesson is the loneliness of the person who noticed. There was one human being in that house who had assembled the true picture, and she was 9, and she had no phone, no money, no car, no vocabulary for what she'd worked out, and no confidence that any adult would do anything except make it worse. Because a grown man had told her, accurately, what would happen if she talked. So she did the only thing left. She rearranged a room. That is what it looks like. It does not look like a disclosure. It never looks like a disclosure. It looks like furniture in the wrong place, and clothes worn to bed, and a kid who has started hugging you outdoors, and a mark on a wrist with a story attached that is one sentence too tidy. Children do not file reports. They post themselves. They take up a position, and they hold it, silently, for as long as their body will let them, and the whole time they are running an accounting of which adults are useful, and if you are not on that list, you will never once be told. Emory was standing right next to it the whole time. Not distracted, not indifferent. A man who reads bodies for a living, sleeping one floor under it. He missed it because the true version required him to believe something about his own house that he had no evidence for yet. And the human mind will not build that room until it is forced to. And here is the part I actually want you to have. He did not find out because he got smarter. He found out because at 10 past midnight he went upstairs for a glass of water and looked into a room he had no reason to look into. That is it. That is the whole mechanism. The unscheduled look. Not the check-in you announce. Not the conversation at dinner where you ask if everything's okay and get told yes. Because a child who has taken a position will tell you yes forever. The look at the wrong hour, when nobody has had time to put the chair back. And if you ever do look in and find that someone in your house has been holding a door on their own, the thing they need first is not your anger at whoever they were holding it against. It is to hear, out loud, from you, that the shift is over, and somebody else has it now. Emory says he did not say that well. He says he mostly just sat on the floor. She got in the car anyway. I'm Nathan.